Thank you, everyone, for joining me for these live internet studies. My name is Arben Lyman Hanavi. I bring you these live internet studies week after week. They're usually an hour and a half long. They're broken up into two segments. The first segment is entitled Eschatology, a Biblical Study of End-Time Events. We study end-time topics like end-time prophecy, Book of Daniel, Olivet Discourse, Paul's letters, Rapture questions, Mystery Babylon, Book of Revelation, things like that. It's an hour long usually. Tonight will probably be a little shorter, but generally speaking, it's an hour. The second segment is entitled A Trinitarian Response to Biblical Unitarianism. It is an apologetic study. It's normally 30 minutes long. I'll probably be a little shorter tonight as well, but we turn into passages that are historically from a mainstream Christian perspective interpreted in Trinitarian fashion, but we are welcoming the challenge from non-Trinitarian challengers, such as Biblical Unitarian in this case, that say, why don't you rethink those passages? Maybe they're not Trinitarian, maybe they're Unitarian. So we're welcoming the challenge, and it's a kind of an ongoing mock debate between me, a Trinitarian, and Biblical Unitarian, which is non-Trinitarian. So those are the two studies. All right, let's jump into our eschatology study. You can see on your screen right now that this is the topical schedule that I'm working from, and it hasn't changed in quite a bit, over a year, coming up on almost 2 years since I last updated it, so it seems to be the direction I'm going. Topic 12, Rapture Views, a Final Analysis. So basically, I'm going to jump right over to the different versions of Rapture, and then I'll tell you where we're going. Let me mark up on my screen. So basically, there are four what I call historic premillennial views that I'm working from. All four of the views share some similarities in that they all believe in a literal kingdom that will be ushered in at the end of the age, or at the culmination of this age that we're living in now. The next age that we're going to experience will be the age of Messiah, 1,000-year millennial kingdom. So within those four views, there's the pre-trib rapture view, the mid-trib rapture view, the post-trib rapture view, and the pre-wrath rapture view. So briefly, what do those views look like? In the pre-trib rapture view, as I'm circling it or highlighting it here, basically there's a rapture at the very beginning of the what they call 7-year tribulation, and a second coming at what they call the 7-year tribulation. There's God's wrath is kind of outlined in the middle of it, a tribulation period at the first 3.5 years, a great tribulation period at the second half of it. But again, pre-tribulation rapturists believe the church will be raptured before this whole final 7-year period known as the Daniel 7th week even commences. So thus the name pre-trib means the church will not have to face Antichrist. That's the basic understanding. Let's move on to the next one. The next one is the mid-trib rapture, and in their estimation, so we'll just call this mid-trib rapture there. In their estimation, they've got a rapture right smack dab in the middle of the same 7-year time frame, and their second coming is at the far end of that 7-year time frame. They've got the same first 3.5 years for their tribulation, the same second 3.5 years for their great tribulation. But the difference is they shrunk God's wrath down, but the church is still excused from going through God's wrath and meeting the Antichrist head on. So mid-tribulation rapturists believe the rapture will occur exactly halfway through the 7-year period, just before the beginning of the Great Tribulation. So similar to the pre-tribbers by design, because the gentleman, Gleason Archer Jr., who is one of the more vocal proponents of the mid-trib position, so you can say he's kind of like the representative of them, spokesman for them, much like... No, I won't make that comparison. But Archer purports that the theology of the mid-trib still borrows from dispensational pre-trib. Church does not have to face the Great Tribulation concept. So that's why they look similar. All right, let's move to the next one. This one is called the post-trib rapture. And so let's just square it off there. Post-trib rapture takes the rapture and the second coming and combines them into a unified event at the very end of the 7-year time frame. They still have their first 3.5 years marked out by tribulation. They have their last 3.5 years marked out by great tribulation. God's wrath occupies the bulk of the 7 years itself. But again, a notable difference is their second coming and rapture are synonymous events. Thus, post-tribulational rapturists believe the rapture will occur following the 7-year period known as Daniel's 70th week. This is a significant difference from the two previous models in that it's obvious by this one, by looking, and this is, by the way, basically a classic version of post-trib, if I remember. By this admission, the church enters into any tribulation period to include tribulation by Antichrist, Great Tribulation time period. The church has to go through that, but the church also must go through the outpouring of God's wrath, although not directly poured out on them. In other words, the church must be protected in some way from the direct effects of God's wrath, either by way of what we call Goshen principle, meaning children of Israel protected from the plagues when Moses and Pharaoh were going head to head against one another. But the greater Israel was protected in many ways, like supernaturally, like a protective bubble over them. Something like that. Other post-tribbers have broken away from this idea that the church has to go through all of the wrath of God and have decided instead that the church doesn't need to experience the bowl judgments. And so there's a different version that I'll show you here in a little bit. But the classic version is what I just showed you a moment ago. And then the final version, which I'm going to give it a star, is the Prewrath rapture. The Prewrath rapture. Let's put a little square around it there. What do we believe? Where's our rapture? Well, the first thing we have is our rapture here, which occurs after the midpoint and after the Great Tribulation has run its course. Where's our second coming? Well, this is where it gets a little bit tricky to articulate unless you follow along very carefully. For us, the second coming is actually a unified event that is initiated by the rapture, but culminates in the Battle of Armageddon. So the rapture and the second coming are part of the same event, but the rapture itself is the initiation activity that kicks off the second coming. And then the second coming runs its course with various events, primarily what we would call those events, or those activities in the middle of the second coming, the ones that are running the length of the rapture to the Battle of Armageddon. We would call those activities primarily the trumpets and the bowls. And then the seventh bowl would be synonymous with the Battle of Armageddon, where Antichrist is finally defeated by Yeshua. So the rapture, the Prewrath rapture, instead of calling the first 3.5 years the tribulation like the other models did, we use the label beginning of sorrows. We believe that this more accurately describes the time period that the church will face without having to say that the church goes into tribulations, quote unquote. We simply say that the beginning of sorrows is something that happens to everyone on planet Earth. It's not really aimed at the church, so to say. It is tribulational in nature, so don't get me wrong. But we've got our midpoint, and then we've got, very important, we've got our great tribulation that takes place kicking off at the midpoint, but running through an indefinite time period until it's cut short by the rapture itself, at which point in time the day of the Lord will then be triggered by the rapture. So there is a separation in the Prewrath rapture between the Great Tribulation and the day of the Lord, or the Great Tribulation, which is Satan's wrath, and God's wrath, which is synonymous with the day of the Lord. And this is an important distinction that we feel is scripturally warranted. So, Prewrath rapture believes the rapture will occur following the opening of the sixth seal of the book of Revelation. That sixth seal is a sign, it's like a trigger event that goes all the way back to the book of Joel and Isaiah, and is picked up in some part in other passages. It's definitely carried over into Yeshua's Olivet discourses, and then Paul doesn't seem to mention anything about this sixth seal event, but it's picked up again in John's book in the Revelation. So Paul kind of ignores or doesn't talk about the sixth seal event. But since Paul does talk about rapture and resurrection, and since rapture and resurrection are definitely found in other passages, then we can know that Paul's speaking of the same event. But so following the sixth seal of the book of Revelation, this is a pre-wrath rapture. The church will experience severe persecution by the Antichrist in the pre-wrath model, but will be snatched away, right? That Greek word harpazo, raptured, before God begins to pour out his wrath during the day of the Lord. When, you might ask, does the salvation of Israel take place in the pre-wrath rapture model? I will deal more with this in the future, but primarily I've been focusing on the rapture of the Christian church by and large. I believe that the salvation of national Israel is going to take place somewhere near the end of the 70th week, which is synonymous with the seventh trumpet, but not to be confused with the last trumpet. So we pre-wrathers believe the last trumpet of Paul's letters, right? 1 Corinthians 15:51, at the last trump, at the in the twinkling of an eye. That passage we believe is a rapture passage, but by comparison, John's description of the seventh trumpet in the book of Revelation is a description of the culmination of the end of this age, the salvation of Israel, the official and legal return of planet Earth to its rightful ruler, which is Yeshua. And then we still have dealing with the Antichrist for the next 30 days, meaning the bowl judgments are poured out. But Israel gets saved 30 days prior to the Battle of Armageddon. You can just say it that way. All right, so let me stop there, at least on those. Let me at least show you as well, though, one more slide. In the alternate version of pre-trib, so we can call this the modified pre-trib, we can call it the hybrid pre-trib, or we can call it the post-trib pre-wrath. Either one, I want to give a fair representation. The classic version of post-trib is kind of this one up top here, and the comparison is the post-trib pre-wrath, the one down here at the bottom. In the classic version, the one up top, the day of the Lord culminates in the rapture at the far end of their model. Why did it do that? Let me try that again. Give me a second. Get rid of that. They just have a rapture at the far end of the 70th week of Daniel, meaning from I think the classics weren't as granular as detailed. That's what I mean by granular. They weren't as granular in their exegesis very early on. They were just kind of painting with a very wide brush when they were looking at end-time events, and they just saw that the rapture was something that took place near the end of that great time period called the tribulation. And why not? Because Jesus says in Matthew 24, verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, and then he goes on to describe events that are, I believe, unmistakably a rapture gathering. So it would make sense that if you just generically said immediately after the tribulation of those days, and if in your interpretation of the word tribulation, you mean the entire 7-year tribulation, which many people do, then it would make sense to put your rapture at the far end. But later, post-trib pre-wrath has decided to be a bit more granular with their treatment of when is rapture in relation to wrath. And so what you notice is that suddenly their rapture here is separated away from the day of the Lord events here. Let me just close that square out. There we go. Rapture is one event. Day of the Lord is a different event. And so thus, day of the Lord is shrunk down to indicate just the bowl judgments, which most end-time teachers would interpret to play out over a span of 30 days, I being included. I believe that the bowl judgments are a 30-day sequence of events. In other words, they're only a month long. And in that scenario, in the post-trib pre-wrath model, the church goes through some hard times. They definitely see the Antichrist, like I agree, but they also have to experience the trumpet activities. So perhaps the post-trib pre-wrath wouldn't call the trumpets the wrath of God. Maybe they would just call it something like judgments Or if they do call it wrath, they're going to have to say that they're sheltered or protected from it. But either way, they're making this distinction that bowl judgments are definitely the intense final wrath of God that we Christians are spared from. So in this way, the post-trib pre-wrath is very, very laser focused on defining this word wrath as only the bowl judgments, whereas we pre-wrathers would say that the trumpet judgments are wrath of God as well, even though we're going to do a study one day and see whether or not we can get that from the text. Does the text actually call the trumpets wrath? Does it use the Greek word orge or thumos or something, one of those two synonym versions for wrath? Well, you might be surprised that it probably doesn't, but we'll have to find out more details later, forthcoming. So let's look now. Let me turn back and kind of park myself at this slide, just in case I need to see all four. Let's go back over to our main study and begin to talk about where I'm going tonight. GotQuestions.org put out a short little essay, and they asked the question regarding the four views. What are the strengths and weaknesses of any given view? And in their perspective, the pre-trib view is the view that they think is the strongest. So Got Questions follows along the lines of your popular pre-trib, Left Behind type theology, Tim LaHaye Jenkins, the LaHaye Jenkins books. Most evangelical Christians who had any familiarity with a Schofield Reference Bible or went to any dispensationally themed or leaning seminary, if you're a pastor, then you've been raised on your standard pre-trib rapture model. Got Questions is no different. It's the majority view right now. Pre-trib rules the roost when it comes to Christianity as far as evangelicals are concerned. I'm not sure that if you just count noses, like Dr. Kurschner is fond of saying, if you just count noses, then the Catholics outnumber the evangelicals, the Protestants, so their view isn't pre-trib. Point being, God Questions thinks that one of the weaknesses of the pre-wrath position is our stance on who goes into the tribulation, who Jesus was talking to in all of discourses. Did the elect mean Israel? Did the elect mean the church? And so we've been kind of entertaining this idea of who is the elect in the scriptures, and particularly when it comes to rapture passages, who are the elect? And what we came to find out is that essentially many pre-tribbers, not all, but many pre-tribbers, have to recognize a group in the tribulation that does come to Christ, but they are not part of the church proper. And so they refer to this group as Tribulation Saints. And this term allows for there to be believers in the tribulation period, the 7-year period, the so-called 7-year tribulation period, allows for Christians to be in that time period, but not be part of the church proper. So what I've done is I created an essay, and I created an excursus. We're in that part now, Excursus 1 of 2. Why are so-called tribulation saints needed in the first place? So I'm just going to scroll past that real quick just to show you it's not very long before I run into a second excursus. The rapture gathering fulfills Israel's covenant calling and includes all who are in Messiah, which is also a very important connected topic. But I don't know if I'll get into that tonight. I just want to start with this first one, which is Excursus 1. Why are so-called tribulation saints needed in the first place? So let's read down through this. It's largely self-explanatory. I don't envision I have to take up all the time because I've really done a pretty thorough job in offering what I believe is a refutation of this idea of the elect in the all of the discourses is exclusively Israel. I think I've refuted that pretty convincingly. At least I think so, right? And then B, I also had a summary that I did last week. So go back and watch the previous two teachings. So now let's look into this excursus. It's kind of a side note. If the so-called tribulation saints idea is not accurate, remember, I'm a pre-wrather, and I believe that tribulation saints is wrong. I'm not saying that there won't be people in the tribulation that don't get saved. Don't get me wrong. There will be saved people in tribulation. I'm simply saying those people are part of the church. If you're saved, you're part of the church. If you get saved before Jesus comes back, you're joining the church. And I'm using the word church there to be synonymous with other terms that are found throughout the Bible: brothers and sisters in Messiah, saints, elect, people of God, holy ones, things like that. These are synonym terms, elect, church, saints, brothers and sisters. These are terms that we find, bride of Christ. These are terms that show up in the Bible to indicate the believing element of the people of God in any given time period. That could be Jew, could be Gentile, but when we say believing, we're saying believing in Jesus. I'm not talking about a generic belief in God from a Jewish perspective. That doesn't qualify them as church. That qualifies them as God's people, yeah, but until they believe in Jesus, their belief in God will retroactively one day prove to be not enough, unless God opens their eyes just a little further and lets them see His Son, but that's between them and God. So don't get confused. Tribulation saints are definitely believers, and they are definitely in the tribulation. But are they part of the church? Pretrib says no. Prewrath says yes. So now I ask the question, if the tribulation saints are if the tribulation saints are truly part of the church, but in the Prewrath model, the Pretrib model, they're not part of the church, why then do the Pretribbers have to invent what I believe is a phantom group in the first place? Phantom from the perspective of being disconnected from the church. Not phantom in the regards of they are really believers and they really are in the tribulation. Those two parts are fact. There are believers in the tribulation. Should we call them tribulation saints? No. Just call them the church. Call them what they are. But why separate them from the church? That's what I'm asking. Why do we need this in the first place? Okay, let's go down. Pre-tribulation rapture proponents must posit the existence of, quote, tribulation saints, end quote, inside their proposed 7-year tribulation period to solve several theological and narrative challenges created by their framework. Here's why they see these saints as necessary.